A poor girl paid the bus fare for a millionaire CEO with her last coins. What he did next surprised everyone. Before we begin the story, leave a comment and let us know which city you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Please subscribe to my channel for more sweet videos like this. Let the story continue. Alexander Hart was driving through the city streets, lost in thought about the responsibilities of the next day. But in a moment of distraction, he turned onto a narrow, deserted street. Before he could get out of there, a group of robbers had already surrounded his vehicle, forcing him to step out with his hands raised. Minutes later, he was standing on the sidewalk. No car, no phone, no wallet. His heart was still pounding as he tried to collect his thoughts, but the reality was clear. He had no way to get home. Taking a deep breath, he started walking toward the main avenue. There were no taxis available, and without a phone, he couldn't call a private driver. His only option was to take the bus a few blocks away. Grace was waiting at the bus stop. It had been a long and exhausting day. Her shift at the diner had been one of the busiest of the week, and all she wanted now was to get home and rest. The bus arrived, and Grace quickly got on, counting her few remaining coins before handing them to the driver. She walked to the back and sat by the window, closing her eyes for a moment. But something caught her attention. "Already told you, sir. No money, no ride," the driver said impatiently to a man standing at the door. He looked nervous, his clothes disheveled, as if he had been through something difficult. "I was robbed. They took everything, my car, my wallet, my phone. I just need to get home," he said, trying to stay calm, but frustration was evident in his voice. The driver crossed his arms and shook his head. Every day someone comes up with that story. No money, no ride. Alexander closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. He had never been in a situation like this before. He was used to solving everything with a simple phone call or a credit card, but now he had no way out. That's when Grace stood up. "I'll pay for his fare." The bus went silent. Alexander looked up, surprised. He hadn't expected anyone to step in, especially not a stranger. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and he saw that she wasn't hesitant or expecting anything in return. She just wanted to help. "You don't have to do that," he murmured. "Don't worry about it. I already did. You better get on before he changes his mind," she replied simply, handing the money to the driver. With no other choice, Alexander accepted. He got on and found a seat a few rows ahead. As the bus started moving again, he glanced back discreetly. Who was that girl? He was used to a world where almost everything came with hidden motives, but this stranger didn't know who he was. She wasn't trying to impress him or get something in return. She had simply helped because she wanted to. No matter how hard he tried, Alexander couldn't stop thinking about it. When the bus reached Grace's stop, she got up calmly and walked toward the door. Alexander felt a sudden urge to thank her. "Hey," he called, making her turn around. She looked at him with mild curiosity, not expecting anything. "Thank you. You have no idea how much you helped me today." Grace gave a small smile. Everyone needs a little help sometimes. And then, before he could say anything else, she stepped off the bus and disappeared into the night. Alexander sat there watching through the window as the bus doors slowly closed. He didn't even know her name, but one thing was certain. He wouldn't forget that girl anytime soon. The bus continued its route through the bright city, but Alexander kept looking out the window, his mind still caught up in what had happened. It was surreal. He, one of the wealthiest men in the city, had just been helped by a stranger who, judging by her simple appearance and diner uniform, probably had much less than he did. His fingers tapped lightly on his knee as his mind tried to process everything. His pride bothered him. He had never needed anyone to do anything for him, and now here he was sitting on a bus with nothing but the clothes on his back and a favor he never expected to need. Grace, on the other hand, had already moved on. The gesture had meant nothing special, just a simple act of kindness. She had been through enough struggles to know that sometimes a small gesture could make all the difference. As the bus neared her stop, she pulled the signal cord and stood up. She walked to the door, unaware that Alexander was still watching her. As soon as she stepped off, he looked away, unsettled by how much that brief interaction had affected him. The next day, Grace left home for another day of work. The small house she shared with her mother was in a simple but cozy neighborhood. Since her father had passed away, she had done everything she could to help with expenses, balancing her time between school and her job at the diner. She walked through the busy streets to the bus stop, just as she did every day. When she arrived, she leaned against the post and waited patiently, enjoying those few minutes of silence before another long day. Meanwhile, across the city, Alexander woke up with only one thought in mind: finding that girl. It was an impulsive idea, but something inside him pushed him to do it. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe something deeper, but he knew he had to see her again. Oliver Reed, he called as he passed through the lobby. The doorman, still surprised by how Alexander had arrived the night before, looked at him with respect. "Yes, sir. I need you to find something for me. I want to know if there's a diner near the bus line that passes through downtown." Oliver blinked in surprise. "Any specific one?" Alexander hesitated for a moment. He didn't know her name, but he remembered the uniform. It must be one where the employees wear blue uniforms. The doorman nodded. "I'll find that information for you, sir." Alexander thanked him and left, feeling like he was making a decision that might not make sense, but for some reason, he couldn't ignore it. A few hours later, the small bell of the diner rang as Alexander stepped inside. The place was simple but inviting, the scent of fresh coffee and baked bread filling the air. A few tables were occupied by regular customers, and employees moved quickly, serving orders. He walked up to the counter, glancing discreetly around, and then he saw her. Grace was behind the counter, arranging a tray with coffee cups. Her hair was tied in a ponytail, and her eyes held a focused glow as she worked. Alexander found himself smiling without realizing it. He stepped a little closer, waiting for her to notice him, but Grace was so focused that it took her a moment to look up. When she did, she blinked in surprise. "You," she murmured. He tilted his head slightly, amused by her reaction. "Me? What are you doing here?" "I came to settle my debt." Grace frowned, confused. "What debt?" "You paid for my bus fare yesterday. I think it's only fair to return the favor." She let out a small laugh, shaking her head. "It was nothing. You don't have to do that." He raised an eyebrow. "Then at least let me buy you a coffee." She hesitated, but eventually shrugged. "If that's how you want to settle your debt, all right." She poured the coffee and set the cup in front of him. Alexander calmly held the handle, watching her as he took the first sip. "Have you been working here for a long time?" 3 years, she replied. "And besides work, what do you do?" Grace looked at him a bit suspiciously. "Why do you want to know?" Alexander gave a slight smile. "Because I'm curious." She considered for a moment before answering. "I study business administration at night. I want to open my own bakery someday." Alexander raised an eyebrow, impressed. "That's amazing." She shrugged. "It's just a dream for now, but I'm going to make it happen." He smiled, admiring her determination. "I believe in you." Grace chuckled softly. "How can you believe that? You just met me yesterday." He took another sip of coffee before answering. "Some people you just recognize right away." She frowned, not quite sure how to interpret that. But before she could respond, a coworker called her name, and she had to step away to assist another customer. Alexander sat there watching her from a distance. He couldn't quite explain why, but he liked being there. He liked the way she spoke, the way she handled everything so naturally. It was something new for him, something that for the first time in a long while felt real. The doorbell chimed again as Alexander walked into the diner for the second time that week. The atmosphere was the same as his last visit. Freshly brewed coffee, warm bread straight from the oven, and the constant hum of customers coming and going. But to him, something felt different this time. Maybe it was Grace. He settled into one of the counter stools, watching her work. Unlike the first time, she seemed more aware of his presence. "You came back to pay off another debt?" Grace asked, pouring him a cup of coffee without him even having to ask. Alexander smiled. "Maybe, but this time I'll pay for it myself." She raised an eyebrow, crossing her arms. "Oh, that's good. I was starting to worry I'd have to help you out again." He chuckled softly. "I don't doubt it. But just so you know, today I came prepared. Grace just shook her head and went back to work. The place was busy, and Alexander took the time to observe her from a distance. There was something captivating about the way she moved behind the counter. Quick, focused, always greeting customers with a subtle smile. But when the rush finally slowed and things calmed down, she leaned on the counter and looked at him curiously. "So, what do you do for a living?" He hesitated for a moment. The real answer could completely change the way she saw him. But instead of lying, he chose the simplest version of the truth. "I work in the hotel business." Grace frowned, a little suspicious. "Hotel business? That doesn't sound simple." He gave a small smile. "When you're born into a family that already has an empire, some decisions are made for you before you even get the chance to choose." She watched him closely, but didn't press further. It wasn't hard to see there was more to his answer than he was letting on. "And you?" he asked, shifting the conversation, "still thinking about that bakery?" Her eyes lit up immediately at the question. "Always. It's my biggest dream." "And what's stopping you?" Grace let out a short laugh. "Money. Time. Circumstances. Take your pick." He smiled. "You don't seem like someone who gives up easily." She smiled back. "I'm not, but sometimes the road is longer than we'd like it to be." He nodded. "I understand." Before they could continue the conversation, one of Grace's coworkers rushed over. "Grace, can you take the order at table 3? Grace gave a quick nod and walked away, leaving Alexander alone at the counter. He sat there watching her interact with customers, chat with her coworkers, moving around with an ease that seemed so natural. For the first time in a long while, he felt at ease, like he had found a place where he could simply exist without pressure, without pretense. And he liked that feeling. When he finished his coffee, Alexander called over one of the staff members to pay before leaving. He left a generous tip and glanced at Grace one last time. She was still busy, but as he walked out the door, he felt her gaze follow him. He smiled to himself as he stepped outside. He would definitely be back. The following days fell into a familiar pattern. Every morning, Alexander stopped by the diner at the same time, always ordering coffee. At first, Grace pretended not to notice, but it didn't take long for her to realize his presence had become part of the routine. He always struck up a conversation, and little by little, their exchanges became more natural. Grace grew accustomed to him, and without even realizing it, she started looking forward to seeing him walk through the door each morning. One day, as he waited for his coffee, Alexander leaned on the counter and said, "Do you have a minute?" Grace gave him a wary look. "That depends. I want to show you something." She hesitated, but curiosity got the better of her. "Okay." Alexander pulled out his phone and opened a photo, turning the screen toward her to reveal the elegant facade of a beachfront hotel. "This is one of my family's hotels." She blinked in surprise. "You own that?" "Technically, I'm the heir to it, but yes, I help run it." Grace studied the photo for a moment. "Sounds incredible." He smiled slightly. "It is, but it never felt like it meant anything to me." Grace raised an eyebrow. "What?" Alexander paused, taking a deep breath. "Because sometimes the most valuable things are found in the simplest places." Grace frowned, not knowing how to respond, but before she could speak, the diner got busy again and she had to get back to work. That morning, for the first time, Grace felt there was something about Alexander she didn't fully understand. And for some reason, she wanted to find out. Later, when the diner closed, Grace stepped outside and walked toward the bus stop. It had been a long day, but something inside her felt different. She wasn't sure what it was. When she reached the stop, she leaned against the post and closed her eyes for a moment. "Is already closed?" She opened her eyes quickly, surprised to see Alexander standing there, leaning against a car that was clearly not the same one from the other night. "What are you doing here?" she asked. He smiled. "Thought I'd give you a ride home tonight." Grace crossed her arms, skeptical, trying to pay off another debt. She bit her lip, studying him for a moment. Then, finally, she sighed and opened the car door. Alexander smiled as he got into the driver's seat. As he drove, Grace glanced at him. Something told her that Alexander wasn't just another customer. And for the first time, she wondered what his real story was. As Alexander drove through the city's bright streets, Grace looked out the window, watching the streetlights reflect on the glass. The ride was quiet but not uncomfortable. On the contrary, there was something intriguing about the moment. "Why do I feel like I should have refused this ride?" she asked, breaking the silence. Alexander smirked, keeping his eyes on the road. "Because I'm not a total stranger." "Exactly." She crossed her arms, pretending to be serious. "You could be a maniac." He laughed, shaking his head. "Well, if I were, I think I would have shown my intentions by now." "True." Grace let out a small chuckle. "But I still haven't decided if I trust you." "And how do you plan to figure that out?" She pretended to think. "I guess I'll need a few weeks of observation." "Weeks? That seems like a long time." "Trusting someone isn't something that happens overnight." Alexander nodded slightly. "Fair enough." The car turned onto a quieter street, and Grace realized they were getting close to her house. That made her wonder about Alexander. He always seemed so at ease, yet he never shared much about himself. "And you?" she asked, glancing at him. "Where do you live?" Alexander hesitated for a brief moment, but kept his smile. "Downtown." "Wow. So, probably one of those fancy buildings I see when I take the bus." She narrowed her eyes. "You like giving vague answers, don't you?" He smiled. "I just like keeping a little mystery." Grace chuckled softly. "Well, I hope it's not a dark secret." "Nothing dark, just a little boring." She frowned. "Why do you think that?" Alexander took a deep breath, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I think I spent too much time following a set script, doing what was expected of me." She didn't quite know what he meant, but she could tell he was being sincere. "Maybe it's time to change the script," he added with a smile. "Maybe." The car finally stopped in front of Grace's modest home. She unfastened her seatbelt and turned to him. "Thanks for the ride." "You're welcome." She opened the door, but paused before stepping out. "Will I see you tomorrow?" Alexander raised an eyebrow. "At the diner?" She smiled. "Yes. See you tomorrow." Grace nodded and stepped out of the car, closing the door behind her as she walked up the porch steps. She felt a small smile form on her lips. The next morning, Alexander showed up at the diner, as usual. The doorbell jingled as he walked in, and Grace glanced over her shoulder, already expecting to see him there. "You really are a man of your word," she teased as she poured him coffee. Alexander smiled. "Always." He took a seat at the counter. "Today I'm ready to try something different." She crossed her arms, amused, venturing into the world of coffee choices. "Yes. What do you recommend?" Grace tilted her head, studying him for a moment, before grabbing a mug and preparing something. "You seem like someone who needs something strong, but not bitter." Was that a compliment or an insult? "Just an observation." She placed the cup in front of him. "Try it." Alexander took a sip, tasting the smooth yet bold flavor of the coffee. "Good. I know." She smiled, satisfied, and went back to work. Meanwhile, Alexander looked around. He liked this place. He liked Grace's energy, the way she interacted with customers, and even the simple routine. It was something so different from the world he was used to. However, as the days passed, and he spent more time at the diner, Grace started noticing little things that made her curious. Alexander never mentioned exactly where he worked. He only said he was in the hotel business, but never gave details. He also had refined habits. The way he held his cup, how he analyzed flavors, the way he talked about travel and places that weren't exactly accessible to just anyone. Grace started wondering who he really was. One afternoon, while wiping down the counter, she decided to ask, "You never told me the name of your hotel." Alexander looked at her for a moment before answering. "I don't think it matters." "Oh, so it's a secret?" He gave a small smirk. "Maybe." Grace crossed her arms. "You really like keeping an air of mystery." Huh. He shrugged. "Let's just say I like avoiding certain judgments." She frowned. "What kind of judgments?" Alexander let out a small sigh. "The kind that make people treat you differently once they find out who you are." Grace studied his response. Something about it felt off, but before she could press him further, a customer walked in, catching her attention. Alexander watched as she went back to work, feeling a slight tightness in his chest. He knew that sooner or later, Grace would find out the truth, and he feared that when that happened, everything between them would change. That evening, Grace was on her way home when something caught her eye. As she walked down the sidewalk, she noticed a luxury car parked on a side street. And who was getting out of it? Alexander. He didn't see her. He was distracted, talking to a man in a suit who looked very serious. Grace stopped, watching from a distance. Something about that scene felt off. The Alexander she knew took the bus, spoke in a simple way, and always said his life was boring. But this Alexander, he was dressed impeccably, surrounded by an air of sophistication. Grace felt a knot in her stomach. Was he not who he said he was? Swallowing hard, she decided she had to find out the truth. For the first time, she wondered if she had made a mistake in trusting him. Grace tried to ignore the uneasiness that had been growing inside her since she saw Alexander on that street stepping out of a luxury car. There was something about him that didn't completely match the image he tried to present. He spoke simply, seemed like an ordinary guy, but little details were starting to suggest otherwise. In the following days, she tried to act normally, but the doubt never left her mind. Who was Alexander really? When he showed up at the diner the next morning as usual, Grace watched him more closely than ever. He was dressed casually, just like always, but there was a quiet confidence about him that didn't quite fit with someone living a simple life. "Good morning," he said, sitting at the counter. "Good morning," Grace replied, keeping her tone neutral as she prepared his coffee. "You seem more serious today," she said. He stirred his spoon in the cup before answering. "Just thinking about a few things." "Good things?" He shrugged. "Haven't decided yet." Grace folded her arms, waiting, and Alexander took a deep breath. "You were right," he said finally. "I shouldn't have kept that from you." She blinked, surprised by his honesty. "It's not really about the money, Alexander. It's just, it feels like you wanted to hide an important part of your life." He nodded. "You're right. Sometimes my life feels more like a cage than anything else." Grace frowned. "What do you mean?" He took a sip of coffee before continuing. "Since I was a kid, I was trained to take over the company. I never had a choice. Every decision was made for me. Even the people I spent time with were chosen by my family." She studied him carefully. "And you never wanted that?" "I never wanted to be surrounded by people who only care about money." Grace stayed quiet for a moment. Now everything was starting to make sense. "Is that why you ended up here?" she asked. He gave a small smile. "I guess so." Grace let out a short laugh. "And what did you find?" He looked at her, holding his cup. "Something real." Grace's eyes locked onto his. She hadn't expected that answer, but something inside her warmed at his words. Before she could respond, a customer called for her attention, and she had to step away. But that conversation stayed in her mind for the rest of the day. Later, when her shift ended, Grace walked outside and found Alexander leaning against his car, waiting for her. She crossed her arms, pretending to be serious. "This is becoming a habit, you know." He smiled. "I thought you'd be used to it by now. And what if I said I want to go home alone today? Then he'd respect that." She looked at him for a moment before finally sighing and getting into the car. This time, the ride was more relaxed. The weight of uncertainty between them was gone. "Do you want to take a little detour before heading home?" Alexander asked suddenly. Grace raised an eyebrow. "Where to?" "It's a surprise." She hesitated for a second, but then shrugged. "All right." Alexander drove for a few minutes until they reached a small park softly lit by old-fashioned street lamps. In the center, there was a gazebo and a lake surrounded by wooden benches. Grace looked around, captivated. "I've never been here before," she said. "Not many people know about this place," he said as they got out of the car and walked to one of the benches. Grace sat down and looked at the lake, where the lights reflected on the water. "Do you come here often?" "Sometimes." "Why need to think?" She glanced at him from the corner of her eye. "And what are you thinking about now?" He turned his face toward her. "That this has been the best thing to happen to me in a long time." Grace's eyes sparkled for a moment before she looked back at the lake. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was a different kind of silence, a silence full of meaning. When Alexander dropped Grace off at home that night, something between them felt different. She stepped inside and closed the door but stayed there for a moment, leaning against the wood, feeling her heart beating too fast. Outside, Alexander sat in his car, looking at her house through the rearview mirror. He knew he was falling in love, but he still wasn't sure if he was ready for it. For the first time, he realized he might not have control over what he was feeling. In the days that followed, Grace tried to ignore the fact that something inside her was changing. What had started as curiosity about Alexander had turned into something stronger, but she didn't want to admit it. She didn't want to let herself feel something for someone who still seemed like a mystery in so many ways. Alexander kept coming to the diner every morning. He was always there, sitting at the counter waiting for his coffee. But this time, Grace watched him differently now that she knew who he really was. Little details started to stand out. The refined gestures, the way he analyzed everything around him, the way he avoided certain questions about his life. She wanted to trust him, but a voice inside her told her there was still something she didn't know. Then, that afternoon, while she was cleaning tables after lunch, she heard a murmur coming from the television mount on the diner wall. Businessman Alexander Hart was seen last night leaving an exclusive event at the Hart Hotel's family property. Sources say he is about to take over as the company's president, following in his father's footsteps. The plate in Grace's hand nearly slipped from her fingers. She turned toward the TV, feeling her stomach twist. On the screen, Alexander was impeccably dressed in a tuxedo, surrounded by reporters and business executives. He looked completely different from the man she knew, the man who said he wanted to escape that world, the man who said he didn't want to follow the path his family had set for him. So it was all a lie, she murmured, feeling a heavy weight settle in her chest. Grace, a coworker called out, but her voice sounded distant. Grace didn't answer. She simply grabbed her apron, untied it quickly, and walked out of the diner. She needed answers. The walk to the hotel felt longer than she expected. Every step felt heavier than the last. When she reached the entrance, the security guards looked at her suspiciously. "Can I help you?" one of them asked. "I'm here to see Alexander Hart." The man frowned. "Mr. Hart is busy." Grace felt her heart race with frustration. "Then tell him Grace is here. He'll see me." The guard hesitated but picked up a radio and murmured something. A few seconds later, he got a response and nodded, allowing her to pass. Grace stepped into the hotel lobby, feeling completely out of place. The floors gleamed, the chandeliers were enormous, and the people around her seemed to belong to a completely different world. And then there he was. Alexander walked down the stairs, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit. He looked more serious, colder. The moment he saw her, his eyes widened slightly. "Grace, what are you doing here?" She crossed her arms, trying to contain her anger. "I should be asking you that." He frowned. "What do you mean?" "I saw you on TV, Alexander. You were at an event last night, talking about taking over your family's company." He ran a hand through his hair, letting out a long sigh. "Grace, you lied to me." His eyes narrowed. "I never lied." "Oh, really?" she said, her voice growing louder. "Then tell me, Alexander, what were you doing here last night while telling me you didn't want this world?" He was silent for a few seconds. "I didn't have a choice." Grace shook her head. "There's always a choice." He took a deep breath, looking at her. "It's not that simple." Grace felt her chest tighten. "You made me believe you wanted something different, that you wanted something real. And I do, but that's not what it looks like." He stepped closer, taking her hands in his. "Grace, please listen to me." She pulled her hands away, stepping back. "I trusted you, Alexander, and now I see I was naive." He looked at her as if he could feel he was losing her. "Don't go. I don't belong in this world, Alexander. Do you think I do?" She took a step back, feeling the tears threaten to fall. "I don't know what to believe anymore." With that, she turned and walked out of the hotel. Alexander stood in the middle of the lobby, feeling an emptiness grow inside him. He didn't know how to fix this, but he knew he couldn't lose her. That night, Grace sat on her porch, hugging her knees. Her mother came outside to check on her and sat down beside her. "Do you want to talk about it?" her mother asked gently. Grace sighed, sitting at the table. "I met someone." Her mother raised an eyebrow. "And that's a bad thing?" "I don't know," Grace said quietly. "He isn't exactly who I thought he was." Her mother smiled knowingly. "Did he lie to you?" "Not exactly. He just left out a few things." "And now you don't know if you could trust him?" her mother asked. Grace nodded. Her mother placed a cup of tea in front of her. "Sweetheart, sometimes people hide parts of themselves because they're afraid of being judged. Maybe he was just waiting for the right moment to tell you." Grace bit her lower lip, thinking, maybe. But even so, something inside me still feels unsettled. The next morning, Alexander showed up at the diner at his usual time. Grace had expected to see him, but this time, something about him seemed different. There was a look in his eyes, almost like he was troubled. She poured his coffee and leaned on the counter. "Is everything okay?" He stirred his spoon in the cup before answering. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday." "What about?" "About me hiding who I am." Grace folded her arms, waiting. Alexander took a deep breath. "You were right. I shouldn't have kept that from you." She blinked, surprised by his honesty. "It's not really about the money, Alexander. It feels like you want to hide an important part of your life." He nodded. "You're right. Sometimes my life feels more like a cage than anything else." Grace frowned. "What do you mean?" He took a sip of coffee before continuing. "Since I was a kid, I was trained to take over the company. I never had a choice. Every decision was made for me. Even the people I spent time with were chosen by my family." She studied him carefully. "And you never wanted that?" "I never wanted to be surrounded by people who only care about money." Grace stayed quiet for a moment. Now everything was starting to make sense. "Is that why you ended up here?" she asked. He gave a small smile. "I guess so." Grace let out a short laugh. "And what did you find?" He looked at her, holding his cup. "Something real." Grace's eyes locked onto his. She hadn't expected that answer, but something inside her warmed at his words. Before she could respond, a customer called for her attention, and she had to step away. But that conversation stayed in her mind for the rest of the day. The idea of opening their own hotel, with Grace's bakery at the heart of it, consumed their thoughts and discussions over the following weeks. It was a challenge neither of them had expected, but together, they were determined to make it work. The plan felt bigger than anything Grace had ever dreamed of. She had always wanted her own bakery, but now, with Alexander by her side, the vision had expanded into something far greater. They spent countless hours sketching out ideas, researching locations, and talking about the kind of hotel they wanted to create. They wanted it to be cozy, welcoming, and authentic. A place where guests felt at home and where Grace's pastries would be the star of the show. A hotel with charm, where the bakery wasn't just a side offering, but the soul of the place. One day, they took a trip to the coastal town that Alexander had mentioned earlier. It was a small, quaint place, away from the chaos of the city. The beaches were serene, the town quiet and full of charm, with colorful homes, cobblestone streets, and an undeniable sense of warmth. They drove through the town, surveying the area. Alexander's eyes were filled with excitement as he showed Grace a piece of land he had his eye on, a spot that overlooked the ocean. It had an old, abandoned mansion on it, which, while weathered, had character. It would take a lot of work to restore, but Grace could see its potential. She could picture the bakery inside it, the scent of fresh pastries wafting through the halls, the cozy dining area filled with people enjoying their morning coffee. "I can see it," Grace said, her voice filled with wonder. "This place, it could be everything we've dreamed of." Alexander smiled, his hand gently squeezing hers. "I knew you'd see it too. It's perfect, right?" She nodded, still taking it all in. "It is. But it's going to be a lot of work. Are we really ready for this?" "I think we're more than ready," he said, his voice firm with conviction. "And we'll do it together. I know we will." They began the process of buying the property, which was more complicated than either of them expected. There were meetings with contractors, endless paperwork, and a mountain of decisions to make. But each challenge they faced only brought them closer. It was clear to both of them that this was the path they were meant to take together. As the days passed, they worked tirelessly. Alexander's business acumen, honed over years in the hotel industry, proved invaluable. But Grace's creativity and vision for the bakery were what brought everything to life. They poured their hearts into the project, each decision made with care and thoughtfulness. A few months later, the hotel was ready. The grand opening was just around the corner, and the excitement was palpable. Grace stood in the kitchen of the bakery, baking her best cakes and pastries, while Alexander made final adjustments to the hotel's decor. The scent of fresh bread and sweet pastries filled the air, blending with the fresh coastal breeze that blew in through the open windows. Grace looked around at the completed space. The hotel's reception area had an elegant, welcoming feel. Large windows let in plenty of natural light, and the furniture was comfortable yet chic. The bakery, tucked away in a cozy corner, was a bright, inviting space with pastel-colored walls and rustic wooden tables. "I can't believe we're here," Grace said, stepping back to take it all in. "This place, it's exactly what I've always wanted." "You've worked so hard for this, Grace," Alexander said, walking over to her. "This is your dream, and now it's a reality." She smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "We've worked for this. Together." He nodded, wrapping his arms around her. "And we'll keep working for it. For us." The grand opening was a huge success. People from the town, as well as tourists, came to visit the new hotel, drawn by the promise of good food, great service, and a warm, welcoming atmosphere. The bakery was the heart of the place. Everyone loved Grace's pastries, and she was finally able to share her dream with the world. As the night went on, Grace and Alexander stood together on the hotel's balcony, overlooking the ocean. The lights from the hotel cast a soft glow over the town, and the sound of laughter and conversation echoed from below. "I still can't believe we did it," Grace said softly, her hand resting in his. "You didn't just do it," Alexander replied, turning to face her. "You made it happen. You believed in it." Grace smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her. "I believe in you too." Alexander leaned in, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You're the best thing that's ever happened to me." She looked up at him, her heart racing. "I feel the same way." Weeks passed, and the hotel continued to thrive. Grace and Alexander settled into their new routine. He was involved in the hotel's operations, while Grace ran the bakery, always experimenting with new recipes and perfecting her craft. They were a perfect team, working together, supporting each other, and building something truly special. One evening, as they were closing up for the night, Alexander turned to Grace with a serious look on his face. "I've been thinking," he started. Grace raised an eyebrow, wondering what he had in mind. "About us," he continued. "We've been through a lot, and I want to make sure that we keep building this. Our life together. No more hiding, no more secrets." Grace's heart skipped a beat. She stepped closer to him, feeling the weight of his words. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I want to spend the rest of my life with you, Grace," Alexander said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Will you marry me?" Grace felt her chest tighten. She didn't hesitate. "Yes. Yes, I will." The wedding was simple, yet perfect. It took place on the beach, with the sun setting behind them as they exchanged vows. The ceremony was filled with love, joy, and promises for the future. Their friends and family gathered around to celebrate, and as they said their vows, Grace and Alexander knew that they had found something real, something that would last. As they danced together under the stars, Grace looked into Alexander's eyes, knowing that this was just the beginning of a new chapter. Together, they had created something incredible, both the hotel and their love for one another. And no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them side by side, knowing that they were building a life worth living.